At 66, Fred Couples is not just a legendary golfer, he is the embodiment of the purest beauty this sport has ever known. His name is synonymous with grace, fluidity, and a natural ease so profound that experts have had to admit no one ever made golf look as easy as Fred Couples. He won the 1992 Masters with the aura of a god, strolling through Augusta, leaving the world stunned when his ball at the 12th hole, destined for the water, miraculously clung to the bank in what is considered a modern miracle of golf. 15 PGA Tour titles, hundreds of weeks in the world top 10, Ryder Cups, President's Cups, and a senior career on the Champions Tour, where opponents decades younger still bow in respect. His swing has been called a symphony without a single wrong note, his demeanor as light as a breeze, so natural that fans didn't just watch him play, they watched him live. But the next 250 words are no longer applause. Behind that flawless beauty was a body tortured for decades, a back so ravaged that every morning he had to brace his hands against the wall for minutes just to stand upright. Fred fought that relentless pain not for one season, but for nearly half his life. Every time he bent to pick up a ball was a knife in his spine. Every step down the fairway was a silent prayer. No one knew that after those gorgeous rounds, he often lay motionless in the locker room, icing his back, gasping, trying to hide the trembling. Yet he never quit. Though his body betrayed him, though marital tragedy, painful losses, and years of loneliness clung to him, Fred kept getting up, he kept playing, kept smiling, kept walking those green fairways, as if his will were stronger than any pain. And that is exactly why America loves him so much. If you want to follow the fractured childhood that forged a Fred Couples so different from the gentle figure on the golf course, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Fred Couples grew up in a house where peace almost never existed. When the front door quietly closed each afternoon, the little home in Seattle split into two opposing worlds. On the outside, a normal working-class family lived on the inside. Emotional storms raged so thick you could feel them just by standing still for a few seconds. His mother, a gentle, quiet woman, moved through the house as if afraid to make extra noise. She rarely smiled, rarely spoke, and the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes came less from age than from years of endurance. His father, by contrast, was hot-tempered and exploded over the smallest things. The atmosphere was always like something waiting to detonate. Some afternoons Fred heard his dad yell just because dinner got cold for a few minutes. Some evenings he saw his mom curled up in the kitchen corner, eyes red but not crying out loud. It was in that heavy space that Fred slowly learned silence, not the silence of calm, but the silence of fear, of a child who understood that one wrong breath could make everything shatter. No one in the house hugged Fred, no one patted his head and said, "You did great." No one asked how he felt after a long day. Love, if it existed, was a vague idea he saw other people have but never belonged to him. Fred couldn't remember the last time his family sat together without arguing. In his mind, love was wrapped in silence, avoidance, and endurance. Lying on his small bed at night, Fred used to wonder if he was the burden. Am I the reason my parents aren't happy? That question became a thorn lodged deep in his soul, and even as he grew up, it never fully disappeared. To escape the shouting, Fred got out of the house as much as he could. Every afternoon after school he hurried out to the hill behind the house, walking far away as if afraid the yelling would chase him. He had no destination, he just wanted to go. Then one day his feet took him to Jefferson Park Golf Course, a public course not far from home. The sound of balls being struck echoed in the wind like a different, gentler, safer rhythm. For the first time he felt he could breathe easy. Fred stood behind the fence watching men hit balls. He didn't understand technique or rules, but something kept his eyes glued. The rhythmic flowing swings soaring into the sky and landing on smooth grass. Everything looked so peaceful, so opposite to the world inside his house. The next day he came back, and the day after that, sometimes just to watch from afar, sometimes to pick up balls for older players. And some days he sneaked an old club and took awkward, but determined swings. Every time the club struck the ball, little Fred felt all the chaotic noise in his head switch off for a moment. Golf wasn't just a sport, it was the only life raft he had. It was the first place he didn't have to be afraid, didn't have to tense up waiting for shouting, didn't have to guess when his father's anger would erupt. On the wide grass he felt allowed to exist in a way he never could at home, free, light, unjudged. And even though he couldn't name it then, golf became the refuge where he patched together the pieces his childhood kept breaking. Years later, Fred Couples became a legend, but the root of that legend was a little boy standing behind a public course fence, desperate for a place that didn't make his heart hurt. And from that first afternoon he knew, if anything could save him from a scarred life, it was the beat-up old club in his hands and the small patch of sky in front of him that no one could take away. Jefferson Park was no prestigious course, nor a place anyone thought a future legend would be born. It was just an ordinary public track, uneven grass, soft spots and hard patches, sometimes the screech of city buses right outside the fence. But to young Fred Couples it was the only place the world stopped hurting him. After every afternoon escaping a house full of arguments, Fred started coming to this course as if pulled by an invisible force. Gradually it became routine. By age 10 he no longer came only in the afternoons. He came in the mornings too, before the sun was up, when cold mist clung to his clothes and Seattle lay wrapped in damp winter breath. Fred walked to the course while the street still slept, shoes soaked with dew, hands numb. He came early not to out-practice anyone else. He came because that was when his parents were still asleep, when Dad hadn't started yelling yet, Mom hadn't started crying, and the house hadn't turned into a battlefield yet. It was the rare slice of the day when he didn't have to brace himself for shouting. And in that fragile quiet, Fred learned to grip a club, rotate, let his body move without fear of being screamed at. But soon the other kids on the course noticed the small boy with the beat-up club. Some laughed, "Hey, you get that stick from the dump." Some mimicked his stance, deliberately hitting it bad to mock him. The rest simply ignored him as if he didn't belong. Every taunt cut Fred, but none hurt like the sentence he'd heard hundreds of times at home. "You make everyone miserable." So instead of reacting, Fred just lowered his head and kept practicing. He was used to nothing beautiful belonging to him, even at the golf course, the place he thought was heaven. Then one day the course manager, an old Italian named Marco, saw the kid show up before even the staff unlocked the gates. He looked at Fred's cracked club, and without a word went to the shed, came back with an old but far better one, placed it in Fred's hands, and said something Fred would never forget his whole life. "Kid, there are fights you can't win at home, but here you can beat anything." To a child who had never heard encouragement, those words were a lifeline pulling him above water. From that day Fred hit balls not just to escape pain, but to prove he was worth existing. People practicing at the course quickly noticed something strange. Fred's swing had a softness the other kids didn't. It wasn't just powerful, it flowed, light, as if his body knew exactly when to release all tension the instant the clubhead met the ball. They didn't know that swing was born from the trembling of a child, trying to stay calm between his parents' fights. Every time Dad yelled at Mom, Fred's heart pounded, his hands shook, and to keep from crying, he learned to breathe deep, relax his hands, let the breath guide his body. Jefferson Park had no idea it was witnessing the birth of one of the most legendary swings in golf history, seeded by the fear of a tear-soaked childhood. On that course Fred was no longer the abandoned kid, no longer the burden, no longer waiting for the next outburst. When the ball soared through the cold mist, past the taunts, past himself, Fred felt his body go light. It was the only moment of the day he could breathe fully. Golf wasn't a hobby for Fred, it was the only rope keeping him from the abyss of childhood despair. And in those early mornings no one knew a poor boy standing alone on wet, cold grass was starting to draw the beautiful arcs the whole world would later look up to. Fred Couples was not born in light, he was born from darkness, and in the moments he fled pain at home, he found the sport that would save his life. When Fred Couples finally got the chance to leave Seattle for the University of Houston, many thought it was his escape hatch. They saw a gifted young man on scholarship with a wide-open future. But no one saw what Fred carried in his luggage: sleepless nights filled with arguing, the feeling of being the extra person in his own family, and the chronic fear that everything could collapse at any moment. When the plane touched down in Texas, Fred stepped through the airport glass doors into a different world, hotter air, stranger accents, faster pace. But what stunned him most wasn't the weather or the distance. It was the realization that from now on he was completely alone. In Seattle, suffocating as it was, he still knew exactly which footsteps were Dad's, which cough was Mom's. In Houston he didn't know anyone. No one waited for him at the dinner table. There weren't even the familiar rages. This silence wasn't peace. It was a void, as if everything he had ever known, even the painful parts, had been ripped away in a few hours of flight. The Houston dorm room was bigger than the little house in Seattle, but to Fred it felt terrifyingly empty. A bare bunk bed, a desk with nothing on it, white walls with no pictures. That first night he sat on the edge of the bed staring out the small window at distant flickering city lights and thought, I really left that place. But the thing that hurts me most is still right here. Fred had no skills for talking about feelings, so he did the only thing he knew: he hid them. The next day he showed up at practice looking polished, calm, with a ready soft smile. To his new teammates Fred was the nice quiet guy who's always smiling, someone everyone liked but nobody really knew. In their eyes he had it all: talent, a scholarship, a shot at stardom. In his own eyes every step onto the range was a gamble. If I fail today, will everyone turn away like Dad turned away from Mom in those endless fights? The more he was praised, the more afraid he became. The better he played, the heavier the pressure. Practices in Houston were brutal compared to anything he'd known. Here nobody was just messing around. Everyone was top tier. Everyone wanted to be seen. Fred understood he was no longer the only kid with a pretty swing at a public course. He was in an ocean of talent, and one bad day could make people forget his name. The night before internal tournaments he couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady hum of the AC, feeling a weird mix: excited, terrified, eager for tomorrow, praying morning would be slow to come. Sometimes his heart raced so hard he had to sit up, breathe deep, grip the bed frame to stop the shaking. He didn't have names for those feelings. Back then people didn't talk much about anxiety, panic attacks, trauma. Men were taught to suck it up, swallow fear, hide weakness. Fred did exactly that. Whenever the nerves surged, he told himself, I'm just too weak, I have to be stronger. And instead of telling anyone, he smiled. That smile later became his trademark, but in Houston it started as armor. In the noisy locker room, Fred often sat in the corner retying his shoes, focusing on tiny details to avoid joining conversations he didn't feel part of. When someone asked something, he answered briefly and politely. When someone teased, he laughed it off. Nobody thought it was strange. They just figured that was Fred, gentle, quiet, chill. No one knew the night before he had sat hugging his knees for hours, trying to calm the feeling he would fail, be abandoned, disappoint everyone. The Houston range was big, clean, had everything Jefferson Park didn't: pro coaches, modern gear, new balls, nice clubs. But one thing Houston didn't have: an old Italian course manager putting a club in his hand and saying, "Here, kid, you can beat anything." In Houston everything was competition. Nobody had time to notice Fred sometimes stared blankly into space. Nobody stopped when they saw him standing alone after practice, hands on his lower back, sighing. Everyone was busy becoming their best selves. Fred too. He hit it better and better. His swing got smoother and smoother, but the cost was that inside he retreated deeper into his own darkness. He learned a new skill, not technical, but survival: silence. When loneliness rose in the dorm, he didn't call home, because calling only meant hearing Dad annoyed and Mom pretending to be fine. When tournament pressure hit, he didn't confide in the coach, because he didn't trust any adult actually wanted to hear invisible fears. When "I'm not good enough" crept in, he didn't tell teammates, because here weakness was hidden under Texas sunshine, not paraded on the range. One late night after a long practice and tiring classes, Fred came back to his room, turned on the desk lamp, but didn't sit at the desk. He slid down the wall to the floor, back against it, staring out the window at distant blinking city lights. The only sounds were the wall clock, and his heart pounding fast and tired in his chest. Suddenly he thought, nobody really gets me. He didn't say it out loud, but it burned into his mind like a declaration. Fred didn't blame the world or get angry. Instead he drew a conclusion: if nobody understands, it's better not to expect it. And from those Houston years a clear personality took shape, a polite, gentle man who smiled at the whole world but rarely let the world see inside. Every time he stepped to the tee, club in hand, he became the Fred Couples. Everyone thought they knew, solid, confident, carefree. But every time the dorm door closed, he went back to his private silent panics, hugging a pillow, staring at distant lights, still telling himself, tomorrow I have to hit it better, tomorrow I can't fall apart. Houston gave Fred the road to the PGA Tour, but it also locked tighter the shell he used to protect his soul. From here on, the polite smile would be the mask, and the wounds from Seattle would be what he carried for life, hidden beneath neat polo shirts and quiet eyes few dared to look into closely. When Fred Couples officially stepped onto the PGA Tour, people saw a young man with soft hair falling over his forehead, a relaxed stance, a gentle smile, and a swing so beautiful commentators ran out of words, like natural, effortless, God-given. The entire tour instantly took notice. Veteran players looked at Fred with a mix of envy. Younger ones saw him as the new icon. That swing, light as wind, gliding through the air like a brushstroke, made everyone believe he was born to dominate the game. But nobody knew that behind that image stood a young man trembling from loneliness. At Houston, loneliness was something Fred lived with on long nights alone in the dorm. On the PGA Tour, loneliness became a constant travel companion, sitting beside him through hundreds of hotels, hundreds of flights, hundreds of different courses. The only difference now was that his loneliness came gift-wrapped in fame. Fred arrived on tour different from the others. He wasn't loud, he didn't brag, he didn't celebrate excessively, and because of that he became even more mysterious. Other golfers admired him but didn't really understand him. Journalists loved writing about his natural ease, but they didn't know that every time he took the club on the tee he had to swallow a knot in his stomach, the feeling he wasn't good enough, strong enough, steady enough to fight the invisible demons he carried from Seattle and Houston. The media adored him, but that spotlight wasn't warmth to Fred. It was a beam shining on his dark corners, making him terrified someone would see the cracks he hid under his polite smile. Sponsors came non-stop. Fat contracts appeared. Big events invited him. Photo shoots costing tens of thousands just to capture the unreplicable swing. But to Fred, every compliment was another small stone dropped on his chest, making it harder to breathe. He knew people saw him as a genius. He knew they expected him to win majors. He knew they believed he'd be the greatest of his generation, and that very expectation terrified him. Afraid of failing, afraid of letting people down, afraid that one day the calm mask would slip and reveal the real him, a young man bad at handling pressure, unused to being loved and clueless about how to hold himself together. At night, when the course lights were off, and the other players went out drinking, Fred went back to his hotel room alone. He opened the door, turned on the light, set down his bag, took off his shoes, and the instant he bent over a sharp pain stabbed his lower back. At first it was just a little twinge, like a needle. Weeks later it became a pulling rip from his waist to his shoulders. Months later it became the reason he had to sit still for minutes every morning before he could stand straight. Back pain, the thing the world would later call the career killer of Fred Couples, arrived quietly, without warning. It came like a silent assassin waiting in the dark for the perfect moment to strike. But in the beginning nobody knew. Nobody saw him frozen on the hotel bed, back against the wall, breathing hard, fingers in his hair as pain sliced through every vertebra. Nobody heard the gasping as he tried to twist to change shirts. Nobody knew that to keep the soft smile on the course, the night before he had to lie on his side for hours, because lying on his back was impossible. In the hotel room the TV was on but unwatched. The desk lamp stayed lit to chase away some of the emptiness. The AC hummed steadily but only made him feel lonelier. In that space you'd think a superstar was living the dream. In reality he was trapped between outside brilliance and inside darkness. Many times Fred looked in the mirror and didn't recognize himself. In the glass was a young man who had everything: talent, career, contracts, looks, crowd love, but the eyes were empty, like someone who didn't know where home was. The more successful he became, the wider the gap between Fred and the world. People thought he was relaxed, serene at ease, but really he was just better at hiding than anyone. Every swing looked like music, but nobody knew it came from nights of exhaustion. Every round full of poise, but nobody saw the painkillers swallowed in silence. Every gentle smile to the gallery, but nobody saw the spasms that made him grip the table edge when no one was around. The PGA Tour was the bright light he had once dreamed of, but it was also a magnifying mirror for every fear inside him. The back pain was only the beginning. Loneliness, pressure and fear of failure kept him in constant tension, slowly grinding him down. Fred Couples had become a star, but the price: prolonged isolation, nameless panic attacks, and constant pain in a young body, was starting to write the darkest chapter of his life. And who knew it was only the opening act of a lifelong war? And then, amid all the loneliness, pressure and pain that grew a little more every day, 1992 arrived like a chapter America still speaks of with awe, the year Fred Couples stepped onto the stage at Augusta National and claimed the Masters, the title every golfer dreams of, but only a handful ever touch. It was the week people said Fred played golf as if he were dancing in the Georgia spring light. Every swing floated weightless through the air. Every chip looked guided by a genius's intuition. Every step he took on Augusta's grass made you feel you were watching a man breathing in unison with the golf course instead of fighting it. But nobody knew that every one of those steps was a negotiation between Fred and the fire in his spine. They didn't know that while the crowd roared and he smiled back, his third and fourth vertebrae were stabbing with every heartbeat, sending silent warnings he never shared. They didn't know that every night after the round he sat hunched in the shower, hot water pounding his back to loosen the spasms while his feet went numb from pinched nerves. America didn't see any of that. They only saw a movie star handsome man hitting golf shots without effort, walking as if the weight of the world had never rested on his shoulders. They didn't know that to keep that likeness he paid with every millimeter of movement in his spine. The historic moment at the 12th was the same. His ball destined, like so many before it in Masters history, to tumble into Rae's Creek miraculously stopped on the bank, frozen as if an invisible hand held it there. The whole world called it a miracle. To Fred that moment felt like a reminder. Life had given him so much pain, it owed him at least one moment of standing on his side. When the final putt dropped on 18, the gallery exploded. Friends and peers rushed to hug him. Cameras zoomed in on Fred's face, the smile, the glowing eyes, the icon of ease and grace. But only he knew that behind that smile a searing pain was racing down his spine like hot wire. After the famous green jacket ceremony in Butler cabin, after the interviews, handshakes, and congratulations, Fred quietly returned to his hotel room. The door closed behind him, and the roar of Augusta vanished as if it had never existed. No more cameras, no more cheers, no more lights, just a dark, almost cold, quiet room, a single chair, and Fred Couples, the brand-new Masters champion, walking like his feet were stepping on broken glass. He set down his bag, took off the green jacket, hung it on the chair. Then, without a word, he sat on the carpet, back against the bed, arms wrapped around his knees. His spine seized so hard he had to close his eyes and breathe slowly to keep the pain from shooting into his legs. No champagne, no celebration, no laughter, just the steady hum of the AC and the exhausted breathing of a man who had just conquered the world, while losing the fight with his own body. In the darkness of that room Fred looked down at his hands, the hands that had made his swing immortal. But he knew the truth. Tonight his body had rung the alarm bell. The 1992 Masters victory wasn't just the pinnacle of his career, it was also the day his loneliness and back pain began to merge, becoming the two shadows that would follow him for the rest of his life. And when he finally turned off the light, leaving the room in total darkness, Fred understood he had just touched the glory every golfer craves. But that same night he touched a truth no one else knew. His crown was forged from pain. The glory was beautiful, but achingly lonely, and no one but him had to pay the price for it. Fred Couples entered marriage with a heart full of empty spaces. He didn't fully understand himself. The 1992 Masters glory made the world see him as the perfect man, polite, warm, gentle, always smiling. But Deborah, the woman who walked into Fred's life when he barely knew himself, saw the dark corners everyone else ignored. She saw the silence. She saw the invisible walls he built around himself. And she saw clearly that beneath the spotlight, the media praised, there was a man who had never learned to love himself, let alone someone else. In the early years, Deborah tried to fill those spaces with tenderness. She cooked for him when he came home exhausted from rounds. She asked, she listened, she patiently waited for Fred to open up. But Fred would only smile, say thank you, then disappear into the den to read the paper, tinker with clubs, watch old swings. She thought it was the focus of a professional athlete. Later she understood it was how Fred escaped. He didn't know how to receive love, didn't know how to give it back, didn't know how to share, because throughout childhood, no one had taught him those things. And Deborah, a sensitive woman who craved connection, began to feel she was in love with a shadow. Nights lying side by side with no conversation, dinners that turned into long silences and became habit, hugs that grew rare and then disappeared. While the outside world saw a beautiful couple, Deborah started feeling cold inside her own home. Then one day that feeling stopped being fleeting, it became permanent. Fred, as everyone knew, was a good man, but in marriage his gentleness and reserve became the weapon that killed love. He didn't cheat, he wasn't violent, he didn't betray, he just didn't speak, didn't open up, didn't let her into his hidden corners. And for Deborah, that hurt like being pushed to the edge of the life of the man she loved most. When Fred traveled to play, she counted the days until he came home. But when he came home, she felt like she was living with a stranger. Years later, she said that every time she heard the front door open, her heart filled with both hope and dread. Hope that Fred would hug her, talk to her, share with her. Dread because most of the time he walked straight past, set down his bag, gave the polite smile he gave acquaintances, and vanished into his own world. Their fights didn't explode in shouting, they exploded in thick, suffocating silence. Deborah would ask, "Do you still love me?" Fred would look at the floor, sigh, say something vague like, "Everything's fine, don't worry," and walk away. She wanted him to fight for the relationship. He stayed silent. She wanted him to speak his real feelings. He only shrugged. She wanted him to stay in the hard conversations. He retreated into the familiar quiet. Fred didn't abandon Deborah, but he didn't hold on to her either. And no one can stand slowly fading from their partner's life. Deborah began to feel herself fade, hollow out, disappear. She had thought marriage was a place where two people leaned on each other to heal. Instead, she found herself healing alone, while Fred drifted farther away. The travel schedule widened the gap even more. Fred lived in the world of tournaments, practice rounds, swing mechanics, sponsor deals. Deborah lived in the world of loneliness, fear, and the feeling of being abandoned even when her husband was sitting right next to her. At first she tried to hold on, then she tried to endure. Finally she let go. The complaints stopped not because things got better, but because she no longer had the strength to love one more day. Their marriage didn't end in a screaming fight or a shocking betrayal. It ended with the very thing that started in Seattle: silence. One morning, Deborah walked into the living room, looked at Fred adjusting a club, and realized she had said too much, tried too much, cried too much, while he had said nothing at all. Nothing opened up, nothing held her, nothing loved her the way she needed. And she understood, love cannot survive when only one person is trying. Fred knew the marriage was dying too, but he didn't know what to do. All his life he had stayed silent when he hurt. So when love was wounded, he chose silence again. Deborah left on a gray day, taking with her every belief, every hope she had ever placed in them. Fred watched the door close without being able to say a word. He only felt a huge emptiness in his chest, something very similar to the feeling he had as a child, sitting in his room, listening to his parents fight, helpless and afraid. The marriage broke not because Fred didn't love Deborah, but because he didn't know how to let love be seen, heard, touched. He loved in silence, and silence is what kills love fastest. And from that wreckage his life began to turn darker, toward a direction no one, not even Fred himself, could have foreseen. But the broken marriage was never the final chapter between Fred and Deborah. Even after the divorce, an invisible thread, fragile and painful, still tied them to memories, to words never spoken, to wounds neither knew how to heal. Deborah walked out of his life, but in Fred's mind she never disappeared. He kept playing, kept smiling, kept wearing the gentle mask he had worn since childhood. But inside he knew a piece of himself had stayed behind that slammed door. Then 2001 came, the year that rewrote Fred's life in the cruelest way possible. One spring afternoon, after a light practice, Fred came home and the phone rang. He picked up as usual. A small, trembling, exhausted voice on the other end told him Deborah had taken her own life. No warning, no final call, no chance to say I'm sorry, or I still care, or please stay. The news hit Fred like a cold blade, slicing his breath in half. He didn't scream, he didn't break down, he didn't ask questions, he simply collapsed to the floor. The person on the line was still talking, but Fred heard nothing more. His ears rang, his heart pounded wildly, then suddenly sank as if crushed. The room spun, the light turned murky, and the floor seemed to swallow him whole. Fred didn't cry right away. He just sat there, head down, trembling hands touching the cold floor, as if needing proof this wasn't a nightmare. Then the first sentence that flooded his mind, louder than any sound he had ever heard in his life: I should have been the one to keep her alive. It wasn't a thought, it was a verdict he passed on himself, and it would cling to him for years, stubborn as a shadow that never fades. The man who had endured pain in silence, for the first time was betrayed by that very silence. Fred was used to not speaking his pain. In childhood, he stayed silent when his parents fought. In his youth he stayed silent when panic attacks struck. In marriage he stayed silent when Deborah needed him most. But now his silence had become the thing he believed pushed her over the edge. He thought of the times she asked, "Why won't you say anything?" He thought of the times she cried while he only stared at the floor, unsure whether to step toward her or walk away. He thought of their final days, two people living side by side like ghosts, trying to hold the relationship together with nothing but exhaustion. And now, Deborah was gone. His silence, the thing that once protected him from hurt, had turned into the knife stabbing his own heart. The guilt nearly kept him from breathing. Sleepless nights, Fred's life crumbled piece by piece. After Deborah's funeral, Fred vanished from the world's sight. He stopped playing, stopped talking to the media, stopped answering calls, stopped answering texts. He avoided friends, colleagues, even the people who loved him most. A career at its peak went dark in a single day. He locked the doors, drew every curtain, and lived in a dark loop. No eating, no sleeping, not a single word. At night he lay staring at the ceiling, eyes wide open, unblinking, trapped between awake and collapse. Every few minutes Deborah's face appeared, her old smile. Afternoons they watched TV together. The times she looked into his eyes, searching for something he never gave. And especially the moment he heard she was gone, the first crack of his heart breaking. Some nights he dozed for minutes, but every time he closed his eyes he saw different scenes. Deborah walking into darkness, Deborah crying, Deborah turning away, Deborah reaching out while he stood too far to touch. The images spun endlessly, no order, no logic, only pain. He would jolt awake soaked in sweat, despite the cold room. His hands shook, his back spasmed, not just from illness, but from stress pushing his body past its limit. Sometimes he stepped onto the balcony in the middle of the night for air. Newport Beach was frozen silent. The ocean wind hit his face, but he felt nothing except emptiness. He asked himself, if only I had held her more, if only I had spoken my feelings, if only I hadn't left her alone. Those sentences became chains tightening around his mind, day after day, night after night, giving him no escape. Depression, the final blow that broke the legend. Everyone thought unbreakable. Fred fell into what doctors later called major depression with post-traumatic anxiety disorder. But at the time he didn't name it. He only thought he was being punished by fate, by destiny. by his own silence. Friends grew worried. Some called, no one heard his voice. Some knocked on the door. Fred didn't open. Some texted, "We're here, Fred." He didn't reply. All his life he had been used to suffering alone, and now he did it again. But this storm was so huge, it wanted to drown him completely. Some days he never left the bed. Some days he stood in front of the mirror, but didn't recognize the gaunt face, the empty eyes, the man who once made entire galleries fall in love. The PGA Tour moved on without him. Tournaments happened as usual. Young players rose. But for Fred, the world had stopped the day Deborah died, and never started again. And then, when it seemed he could never stand again, Fred had to face the most painful truth of all. No one saved Fred then. No mentor, no teammate, no one close enough to pull him from the abyss. He had to do it himself, but not with strength, with total collapse. One night he turned on the living room light, sat in the middle of the dark, silent room, and spoke the sentence he had never said to anyone in his life. "I made her so lonely she had to leave." That was the moment he shattered. The first time in his life he truly faced his pain instead of burying it. And from that moment a new journey began. Not the journey back to the PGA Tour, the journey of survival, surviving the greatest pain of his life. Surviving guilt, surviving his own silence. Deborah's tragedy didn't just take away someone he once loved. It forced Fred for the first time to look straight at himself, at the wounds from Seattle, the loneliness from Houston, the silent years on tour, all the things that destroyed his marriage and kept him from being there for the person who needed him most. And from those ashes, Fred slowly learned to stand again, but with a heart that would forever carry a pain he never put into words, a pain that would follow him for life, a pain that even at 66 he still carries in the sad, quiet eyes that look out over Newport Beach. After Deborah's death, Fred thought his soul had hit rock bottom of pain. But life didn't stop at emotional agony. It began attacking his body too. The torment in his heart had barely started to scar when his spine, the thing that had smoldered for years, began to collapse piece by piece, like a rotting bridge. If before back pain had only been a quiet intruder, after the 2001 tragedy, it became a full traitor. His body could no longer bear the weight of decades of competition, stress, and sleepless nights. And in this phase, his back decided it no longer wanted to fight. One morning he couldn't stand up straight, the first sign of total collapse. One morning Fred opened his eyes, tried to sit up, and instantly felt a hot iron rod shoot from his lower back. He fell back onto the bed, gasping, sweat pouring, even though the room was cold. He tried to roll, failed, tried to lift his hips, failed, tried to push up on his arms. A bolt of pain shot to his neck so fierce, he bit his lip to keep from screaming. He lay there nearly half an hour, motionless, locked in place by his own body. Finally he inched to the edge of the bed, and stood by clinging to the dresser. His back was hot, burning, numb, stabbing, all at once, as if the bones themselves were on fire. That wasn't normal pain anymore. That was his body sending a message: "I can't take any more." Nights curled up in darkness, body and pain competing to kill him. Night became the enemy. Fred lay on his side, clutching his stomach, knees drawn up like a child, trying to protect himself. Back pain wasn't the kind that makes you cry once and passes. It stalked every breath, every heartbeat, every tiny movement. Some nights he stayed awake until 4 a.m. His back burned so hot, his t-shirt stuck to his skin. The pillow soaked with sweat. He twisted and turned, but every shift made him groan as electricity shot through his spine. Sometimes he crawled out of bed and lay on the cold carpet to take pressure off the spine. But the cold only made muscles seize tighter. He lay there in the Newport Beach darkness, breathing in gasps, drenched, utterly alone, just as he had lived most of his life. The doctor's warning: another knife in the heart. After months of suffering, Fred was taken to a specialist. He sat on the exam table wincing, one hand cradling his back, as if holding it together. The doctor studied the MRI in silence, long enough that Fred could barely breathe. Finally the doctor spoke, voice low but heavy enough to crush the listener. "Fred, if you keep pushing your body like this, you may never play competitive golf again." Those words landed like boulders. Golf wasn't just a job, it was the only place he ever felt peace. The place that saved him from a broken childhood. The place that healed the loneliness of Houston. The painkiller for divorce and depression. Golf was the only place he knew how to exist, and now a doctor was saying he could lose it. Fred stared at the floor. He didn't cry, but an ancient fear, the exact same fear he felt as a little boy, listening to his mother cry and his father yell, rose up again. This time no one was blaming him, but he blamed himself. "Even my body is abandoning me." Tournaments left unfinished, his body betraying him in front of thousands. Before Fred hid the pain on the range, backstage in hotel rooms. But now his body could no longer protect him in public. At many events he had to stop mid-round, not because of bad shots, but because he literally couldn't stand. Once after his opening drive in the second round, his back locked so hard it felt like someone was gripping it. He bent over, hands on knees, trying to breathe but unable. The crowd thought he was tired. The truth was the pain was so bad, he couldn't feel his legs. His caddy came over, took the bag, whispered, "You okay, Fred?" He just shook his head, eyes red but still forcing the familiar smile, the smile he had used his whole life to hide everything. Then he withdrew. Cameras caught him walking off, left hand pressed to his lower back, right hand giving a small wave to the gallery. Fans thought it was just a minor injury, but with every step his spine was screaming, "I can't do this anymore." Some tournaments he quit at the 8th hole. Some he showed up but couldn't swing more than twice. Some he spent the whole day in the cart watching others play while he gritted his teeth. Every time he walked off a course, he felt like he was failing again, not the tour but himself. The body collapsed, but the mental pain was what truly killed him from the inside. Physical pain has medicine, has treatments. Mental pain has no pill strong enough. Every spasm in his back triggered memories of Deborah, memories of silence, memories of always letting people down. Those memories fused into an obsession heavier than any injury. Fred began to fear the practice tee, fear bending over, fear swinging, fear mornings when his body was stiff as wood, fear nights when the sheets were soaked, fear the worried looks from people who loved him, and fear, the most familiar fear of his life, that he would be alone again. This time not because a marriage ended, not because Deborah was gone, not because of a shattered childhood, but because his body, the one thing he had always trusted, had finally left him. Fred Couples, the legend with the most beautiful swing in history, was slowly falling, quietly, in the bright lights of golf courses, but in the absolute darkness of his own soul. After years that seemed to drag him to the absolute bottom of a life, already full of loss, Fred Couples entered a phase no one believed he could rise from. Depression had eaten away at his mind. Back pain had paralyzed his body. Deborah's death had left a wound that would never heal. And the golf world had quietly moved on to a new, faster, stronger, longer generation. But then, in the darkest days, when it felt like his back had finally broken, his heart had gone out, his career had closed its doors, Fred stood up, not with brute strength, but with something else, a will that made the entire world stand in respect. The Champions Tour, meant for golfers over 50, was supposed to be a quiet stage for legends past their prime. For Fred it wasn't a place to retire, it was the place he chose to be reborn. When he showed up again, many thought he was just testing the waters, chasing a last taste of competition, or saying a polite goodbye after a few rounds. But from the very first swing, something was different. Still the same silky, water-like motion. Still the same light steps that barely touched the ground. But now, in every shot, there was something new that had never been there before. Pain turned into power. After months of crisis his back still hurt so badly, that every morning he had to sit motionless for minutes before he could stand straight. But when he stepped onto the course he swung as if every shot was a declaration that he had not fallen. And then the unthinkable happened. Fred started winning. Not just once, not by luck. He won with the poise of a legend rising from his own ashes. When he won on the Champions Tour at age 52, the crowd stood and applauded for a very long time, not for the score, but because they knew they were witnessing a miracle. A man who had walked through tragedy and illness and was standing tall again. When he won again at 53, many fans cried openly in the stands. Some buried their faces in their hands. Some wiped tears in plain sight. They weren't just watching Fred play, they were watching him survive. Watching a human being who had lost almost everything yet still stared into the darkness and kept walking. Those rounds were no longer golf, they were release, a conversation between him and himself, his way of telling the world, "I'm still here." At 55, when he won yet again, the broadcaster choked up on live television. A man once told by doctors, "You may never play at a high level again," was now playing so well. People forgot he had a history of crippling back pain. A man who had sunk into depression so deep he wouldn't open the door for anyone was now standing in front of thousands roaring his name. A man who once collapsed to the floor, hearing his ex-wife was gone, now lifted his head and soaked in the crowd's love like sunshine after a storm. Fred didn't come back to prove anything. He came back because it was the only thing that kept him moving forward. Golf didn't heal everything, but it gave him a reason to get out of bed each morning, a reason to stand tall, a reason to fight the back condition that had tortured him for half his life. And to fans, Fred Couples became something few athletes ever do, the symbol of a man who doesn't know how to quit, not because he is unbreakable, not because he is invincible, but because he has been broken, has fallen, has been through hell, and still gets up. Almost everyone has always said, "Fred makes golf look so easy," but the Champions Tour showed the world the truth he makes going on living, after everything, look extraordinary. When he lifted the trophy at 55, his hand trembled slightly, his back stabbed with pain, but his eyes shone like the first time he ever struck a ball at Jefferson Park as a child. That wasn't the light of a winner. That was the light of someone who had walked through darkness and come back out the other side. Someone who, not even once, let life end the way it wanted to. And from that moment on, America didn't just love Fred Couples, they respected him, not because he had the most beautiful swing in the world, but because he lived the most beautifully. Even though the Champions Tour brought Fred Couples back into the light of golf, it didn't bring him peace in his personal life. Because after the collapse of his first marriage, after Deborah's agonizing death, after years of self-blame and depression, Fred's heart entered a phase where even he didn't know what he wanted, or whether he was still capable of loving anyone again. Fans saw a reborn legend on the course, the same breezy smile, the same courteous manner, the same magnetism of a seasoned man. But off the course Fred was frighteningly alone. He had money, fame, good looks, but every time the front door closed he returned to the same old emptiness that had followed him his whole life. And that very loneliness led him into relationships full of storms. A gentle man in relationships that were anything but gentle. Fred Couples was never the type to make noise or court scandal. He avoided conflict, avoided arguments, avoided any kind of confrontation. Yet paradoxically, that exact personality type falls hardest into the most unstable relationships, because he didn't know how to protect himself, didn't know how to set boundaries, didn't know how to say no, and above all didn't know how to walk away when he was being hurt. After Deborah, Fred tried opening his heart a few times, but those relationships went nowhere, partly because he had never truly healed himself, partly because the women who entered his life didn't understand that behind the quiet was a mountain of unhealed wounds. Loves came and went like unpredictable winds. Each ending only deepened his belief, "I'm not good enough to keep anyone." The storm with Tawny Keaton, the darkest chapter of Fred's romantic life. Then Tawny Keaton appeared, a former Hollywood star, beautiful, strong-willed, but also deeply unstable and stormy. Their love started fast, intense, overwhelming. And because of that, it crashed, just as terrifyingly fast. Fred, the man who avoided conflict, met Tawny, the woman who feared no conflict. Fred, who kept every emotion inside, met Tawny, who exploded like fire meeting wind. They were drawn to each other like opposite poles, but the closer they got, the more they destroyed one another. Scandal erupted. The media dug, smeared, exaggerated. Tawny had violent outbursts, uncontrolled emotions, explosive reactions that swept Fred, who was already sensitive and easily wounded, into a whirlwind he didn't know how to escape. There were police interventions. There were lawsuits. There were times Fred skipped events because his back hurt, only for tabloids to write it was fallout from romantic drama. For a private man like Fred, all of it felt like new knives into an already scarred soul. He didn't fight back, didn't speak ill, didn't explain, didn't accuse anyone, he just quietly endured, as he had done his whole life, and that endurance drained him dry. But the scariest part wasn't the scandal, the lawsuits, or the prying eyes of the press. The scariest part was one day looking in the mirror and not recognizing himself. A man who had lived by calm, by kindness, by soft smiles, now saw himself standing in a relationship full of chaos, shouting, rage, blame. He had never grown up in a happy home, but he had once hoped to create what he never had. Now even that hope lay in pieces. Once again Fred ended things with silence. The relationship with Tawny fell apart exactly the way most things in his life fell apart. No final screaming match, no accusations, no one shouting, "We're done." It dissolved like mist in sunlight, a quiet disintegration. One day Fred simply stood up, walked out of the house, closed the door, and never came back. Not out of hate, not out of anger, but because he knew once again, silence was what protected him, and what destroyed him. Through every romance Fred learned a bitter truth. There were good women who came into his life after Deborah, gentle, kind, patient women, but they left too, not because he treated them badly, not because he was careless, but because he didn't know how to be in a relationship where his heart had to stay open. He pulled back whenever feelings got too close. He went silent whenever someone needed words. He escaped to the range whenever fear of intimacy appeared. And so, everything dissolved again. By the time he was over 50, his friends were married, raising kids, enjoying joys he had never touched. Fans asked why he was still single. He just smiled, always the same answer, "I just haven't met the right person." But inside he knew the darker truth. "I'm not good at keeping happiness." He believed he was the common denominator in every failure. He believed his heart was born with a hole in it, and anyone who leaned on it would fall through. And so Fred kept living, with golf, with back pain, with late career triumphs. But in love, he remained a lost man, the complete opposite of Magic and Cookie. If Magic Johnson had Cookie, the woman who pulled him from the abyss, who saved their marriage with love and resolve, Fred never had a Cookie in his life. No one held him back. No one was strong enough to drag him out of the loneliness rooted in him from Seattle, all the way to his gray hair. Fred never found the keeper of the flame, never found the one who stays, never found the person he could be himself with. Fred's love life, in the end, was one long sad ballad. Every verse beautiful, every verse unfinished. A gentle, kind, famous, talented man loved by millions, yet unable to keep any love beside him. And that hurt him more than back pain, more than scandal, more than any loss on a golf course. Fred's romantic history wasn't a string of mistakes. It was a string of prolonged wounds. Every short-lived relationship, every silent breakup, every lonely night, carved deeper the conviction that he was not built for lasting happiness. And in middle age he looked back at the road behind him, full of titles, lights, victories, glory, but missing the one thing every human craves, someone to hold hands with when night falls. That is the tragedy of Fred Couples, a tragedy without screams, without public tears, without dramatic scenes. His tragedy is prolonged emptiness, doors closing in silence, people leaving without blame, and his heart always wanting to love, but never learning how to keep love from leaving. After years lost in unfinished relationships, after endless self-blame, after nights lying alone in fame but absolute solitude, Fred Couples entered his 60s with a heart like glass cracked hundreds of times. He no longer expected to find the love of his life. He no longer believed he was whole enough to keep anyone. He accepted loneliness as an inevitable part of growing old, until Suzanne appeared, quietly, gently, not a Hollywood star, not someone who walked in to change his life like in the movies. Suzanne came to him in the simplest way, with kindness. Suzanne, the first person who didn't love the image of legend Fred Couples, but loved the real man. Fred met Suzanne at a charity event he only attended because he had promised a friend. In a noisy crowd of famous faces, Suzanne quietly stood in a corner talking to volunteers as if they were old friends. No one introduced them, no cinematic spotlight, no fateful moment, just two people standing side by side, watching kids play mini-golf, both smiling when the children fought over a putter. But Suzanne's smile, light, warm, without admiration or expectation, made Fred feel something he hadn't felt in years, safe. To everyone else he was Boom Boom, the golf legend, the most beautiful swing in the world. To Suzanne he was just a man trying to stay upright in life. For the first time in decades, Fred felt truly seen. Their conversations didn't start with golf or fame. They started with small things: favorite foods, songs she listened to, childhood stories, fears, sadness. What surprised Fred most: Suzanne wasn't afraid of silence. She didn't push him to talk, didn't bombard him with questions, didn't demand he be any version other than himself. She simply sat beside him, sometimes saying nothing, and to Fred that was more healing than any big conversation. For the first time he felt he didn't have to perform, didn't have to smile on cue, didn't have to pretend to be strong, didn't have to hide fear behind his eyes. Suzanne saw the cracks in him, but she didn't see them as a burden. She saw them as proof of a life that had fought too much. Fred learned something he had never learned in his whole life: how to speak his pain. One afternoon on the balcony overlooking the ocean, Fred told Suzanne about Deborah, about the marriage that fell apart, about the silence that killed love, and about how her death broke him. He had never told anyone that story. When he reached the part about getting the phone call, his voice cracked and broke. Suzanne didn't say, "It's not your fault," didn't say, "It's in the past." She simply placed her hand over his, light but firm. That alone made Fred's heart soften, a feeling he thought he was no longer capable of. In that moment, he realized he had lived his entire life in silence, carrying every pain like a private burden he never dared put in anyone else's hands. But with Suzanne, he learned the simplest and hardest thing: sharing pain doesn't make you weaker, it just makes you less alone. Late love, fragile but profound. At 60 people don't love like they do at 20. No impulsiveness, no rush, no oversized promises. Fred and Suzanne loved with simple things: walks together, watching TV together, evening tea, reading side by side, comfortable silence. And that very simplicity made the love deep. But the older you get, the more love comes with fear. The fear of losing each other. Some mornings Fred woke up, looked at Suzanne sleeping peacefully beside him, and for a second his heart clenched. He feared his back would hurt so badly one day he couldn't walk hand in hand with her anymore. Feared age would take his strength before he could stay with her long enough. Feared fate, the same fate that cruelly took Deborah, would once again take the person he loved. And he knew Suzanne had the same fears. At 60 you're no longer building a far-off future. Every hug, every shared meal, every conversation is worth more than gold, because you know time is no longer endless. Gentle love. But the thing that finally helped Fred heal: Fred was no longer the strong man of his youth. His spine still hurt. Every night there were moments he had to sit up and rub his back. But now, he no longer went through those nights alone. Suzanne couldn't make his back stop hurting, but she placed a hand on his shoulder and made him feel he was no longer fighting by himself. Some evenings he told her about the Champions Tour, about his fears as old age approached. Suzanne didn't promise everything would be fine. She simply said, "I'm here." And for Fred Couples, the man who spent a lifetime isolating himself in silence, those 3 words were the greatest miracle. Love at the end of life, not the greatest love, but the most perfectly timed. Suzanne didn't come into Fred's life to change everything. She came to remind him that his heart, no matter how battered, could still love, could still be loved. And that was enough for Fred to feel he hadn't wasted a single day of his life. Not because of how many trophies he won, not because of how beautiful his swing was, but because, after everything, he could still hold someone's hand when darkness fell. That's what late love is: more fragile, more fearful, more painful, but also deeper, more precious, more beautiful than anything youth ever brought. To Fred Couples, Suzanne wasn't just a partner, she was the final blessing life, after all the storms, was willing to give him. At 66, when the golf course lights now shine on newer generations, when the roars are no longer as loud as when he ruled the game, Fred Couples has entered the phase people rarely talk about in sports movies or victory memoirs, the phase no legend can escape: old age. But for Fred, a body betrayed for decades, a heart cracked since childhood, old age doesn't arrive as a gentle slowing down. It arrives as a constant smoldering storm that destroys whatever is left, day and night. Mornings, the first battle of every day. No morning for Fred begins with jumping out of bed. There is never a moment he stretches, yawns, and walks like everyone else. His mornings begin as a painful ritual, repeated so often it has become a sentence. Pain, breathe, wait, try, pain, stand. When he opens his eyes, he never knows how long he actually slept or how much he tossed and turned all night. The first thing he feels is not sunlight through the curtains, but the stab running from his lower back to the middle, like an old knife that never dulls. He can't sit up right away. He has to roll over very slowly, as if his entire spine is a thin sheet of paper about to tear with any sudden move. Every roll he lightly bites his lip so he doesn't groan out loud. Suzanne usually hears his sharp breathing first thing each morning, a sound caught between pain, exhaustion, and age. Some days she places a hand on his back and waits for his breath to steady before helping him sit up. Some days Fred just gently shakes his head. Let me do it myself, I have to get used to it. But the truth is, he has never gotten used to it. No one ever gets used to their own body becoming hell the moment they open their eyes. His spine, like a stack of paper torn over and over again. The doctors described Fred's back with a phrase he never wanted to hear again. Your spine is like torn paper, worn-out discs, pinched nerves, segments of bone that had endured millions of twists, bends, hip turns, now desperately resisting every time he tried to get out of bed. It was no longer just herniated, no longer just chronic back pain. This was the kind of damage only people who have lived their entire lives through their bodies, and then been betrayed by those same bodies, can truly understand. When he was young, every swing was a soft symphony. Now every bend to tie his shoes is a painful negotiation. The long nights when silence hurts more than the spine itself. During the day Fred can still smile, talk to fans, speak at events or show up at the range. But when night falls, when every sound disappears and the house sinks into darkness, old age and pain merge into a giant shadow pressing on his chest. Some nights he sleeps less than 2 hours. Pain jolts him awake, heart racing, body burning. He gets out of bed and walks through the dark like a lost ghost. The soft shuffle of his feet on the wood floor, the heavy breathing, the hand braced against the wall for balance, all of it blends into a loneliness that makes the house feel 10 times larger. Suzanne sometimes wakes to an empty, cold side of the bed. She walks into the hallway and sees Fred standing at the window, one hand on his lower back, the other gripping the frame, eyes fixed on the pitch-black night over Newport Beach. Hurting again, she asks softly. Fred doesn't turn around. I'm okay, just need to walk a little. The answer is always the same, and the most heartbreaking part, there are nights he truly wants to reach for her, to rest his head on her shoulder, and stop fighting for a moment, but he can't bring himself to do it. He doesn't want Suzanne to see him that weak. He doesn't want to become a burden. Just like the rest of his life, Fred still chooses to suffer alone, even when the woman beside him never wanted him to. Friends grow fewer, because everyone is getting old, getting sick, or leaving this life. One of the cruelest things about old age is that your contacts list grows lonely without anyone ever deleting a number. The golfers of Fred's era, the guys he used to drink beer with after rounds, the ones who rode the tour buses with him, now some walk with canes, some are in hospitals, some no longer remember faces, some no longer recognize anyone at all, and some are simply gone. Fred's phone used to ring all day, buddies wanting to hit balls, sponsors inviting him to events, colleagues checking in, fans asking for pictures. Now it rings rarely. When it does, it's usually the doctor's office, or a hotel confirming a reservation. Everything else, silence. A silence that reminds him of childhood, the silence after his parents fought, the silence that sent him running to the golf course every afternoon. But this time, the silence isn't born of anger or fear, it's born of old age, something no one escapes. Some days Fred flips through old photo albums and sees himself with Payne Stewart, with Seb Ballesteros, with legends long gone. He places a hand on the picture, eyes sinking. They all went before me. The words sound light, but inside is a sadness only those who watch their friends disappear one by one truly understand. The greatest fear, living too long, alone. It's not death that scares Fred. He has faced death many times, in the depression after Deborah, in the days his back hurt so badly he thought he was breaking in half, in the nights he stood at the window, wondering if he had the strength to see another morning. What scares him most is outliving everyone he loves, living to watch friends leave, living to see the legends of his generation laid in the ground, living to notice the old fans no longer in the crowds anymore, living to see his own aged face in the mirror while the world spins faster toward younger, healthier, less painful people, and most of all, living long but alone. Some nights he lies beside Suzanne, watches her sleep, and his heart tightens. What if one day she goes before me? He was once talented, once wealthy, once so famous people recognized him everywhere he went. But now fame cannot soothe this deepest fear, that he will end up exactly where he started. A lonely little boy hearing only his own breathing in the dark. Fred's old age is not a closing, it is a full confrontation. At 66 every step Fred Couples takes comes with the click and creak of bone. Every lean is a reminder he is no longer young. Every sleepless night is a long battle with loneliness. Yet the strange and most beautiful thing is this: he does not quit. He still practices, still tries to stand tall, still offers that polite smile to fans, still does charity work, still loves golf, the thing that has saved him from the abyss hundreds of times. And in the pain of old age, Fred has become something few legends ever do, the symbol of the person who keeps living, even when the world has gone quiet. No more applause, no more roars, only the sound of bones creaking when he turns in the dark. But in that creaking is an entire lifetime of fighting, and a heart that has never surrendered. At 66, as Fred Couples' steps grow slower, and his back bends lower under the weight of time, people no longer see him only as an athlete, but as a cultural icon, a figure American golf history will speak of with a mix of reverence and heartache. Because the legacy he leaves is not just victories or swings that look like poetry. The true legacy of Fred Couples is a life lived with a sad smile, beautiful enough to make America fall in love, sad enough to make America cry. The man with the lightest, most beautiful, saddest smile. No one in golf history has a smile quite like Fred's, a gentle smile that seems to float between two truths, real joy and real sorrow. It is not forced. It is not the dazzling grin of conquerors. It is the smile of someone who has walked through darkness, been torn apart by life, yet still tries to make the person across from him feel light. It is the smile of Jefferson Park, where a child escaped his parents' shouting by standing in the cold mist practicing swings. It is the smile of Houston, where a young man sat alone in a dorm room, staring at distant lights, convinced no one truly understood him. It is the smile of the PGA Tour, where a man cheered by thousands curled up alone in hotel rooms, because his back hurt too much to breathe. It is the smile of the 1992 Masters, the smile the world thought was his happiest, when in truth it was hiding the pain, ripping his spine apart on his greatest day. It is the smile of a man standing silently at his ex-wife's funeral, silence so heavy it broke hearts. It is the smile of the Champions Tour, when he won at 52, 53, 55, and fans wept because they knew what it cost him to stand on that stage. And now that smile is still there, fainter, thinner, trembling with every stab of age. That smile is Fred's greatest emotional legacy, a genius who never made enemies, never acted arrogant, never showed off. In a sport where egos are often bigger than the game itself, Fred Couples is a paradox. He never tried to be the center of attention, never bragged, never argued with the press, never spoke a harsh word about anyone. In an era when many athletes flaunt wealth, fame, and difference, Fred chose quiet, courtesy, the gentleness of a breeze down the fairway. People love him not just because he was great, they love him because he was good, truly good. He never hurt anyone, never made anyone uncomfortable, never made anyone feel small. If anyone was ever hurt by him, it was only one person, himself. A heart that endured too much pain yet never lost its kindness. Fred has taken blows from life most people could not survive. A childhood without peace, panic attacks in Houston, loneliness that blanketed his early tour years, Nita's daily knife-like back pain, a marriage destroyed by his own silence, Deborah's agonizing death that crushed him, the physical collapse when his body betrayed him, sleepless nights at 66 with nothing but the sound of bones in the dark. Yet through all that pain, Fred never paid life back with bitterness, never lost his gentleness, never let anyone see him angry. A man carrying that many scars could easily have become gruff, withdrawn, cold, even cruel, but Fred didn't. He chose kindness, even though kindness made him more vulnerable. He chose gentleness, even though gentleness cost him. He chose to love life, even though life rarely loved him back. And that is why America sees him not just as a golfer, but as a true gentleman. American golf loves him not because he was perfect, because he never pretended to be. In a world of pressure, expectation and spotlight that changes people, Fred kept one thing his whole life: authenticity. He never used scandal for fame, never sought shock value for headlines, never built a fake image. He was just Fred Couples, gentle, a little sad, a little lonely, but so genuine you felt it the moment you stood near him. Legend Tom Watson once said, "There were players better than Fred, but no one we loved as much as Fred." And that statement has never been wrong. A legacy measured not in trophies but in the hearts of fans. Fred Couples doesn't have the most majors. He didn't dominate like Tiger. He didn't have the unbroken reigns of Nicklaus or Palmer. But he has something few legends possess: an emotional legacy. Americans don't remember him for how many times he won. They remember him because they see themselves in him. The days you hurt but still have to smile. The sleepless years when you still have to keep going. The loves that didn't last yet didn't make you bitter. The quiet failures no one ever understood. The moments you got back up in pain, not for glory, but because you refused to quit. That legacy isn't in his trophy room. It lives in the hearts of fans who cried when he won at 52. It lives in the eyes of young golfers who look at him with awe. It lives in the simple, powerful reminder: you don't have to be perfect to be someone America loves. Fred Couples, the genius of beauty who carried a lifetime of sadness in his smile. Looking back on Fred's journey, we see a paradox so beautiful, it takes your breath away. His swing is the most beautiful in modern golf, yet his life is full of wounds. He made golf look the easiest, yet his life was the hardest. He smiled the gentlest, yet carried the deepest sorrow. He was the kindest yet suffered the most. The American golf legend, the man of wind-like grace, of a swing like a painting, of a smile that melted entire galleries, was in truth a fragile heart carrying so many cracks no one could ever count them all. But those very cracks made him more human, more beautiful, more real. And the legacy he leaves America is not greatness, it is gentleness. Gentleness in a world that grows rougher every day. Gentleness from a genius who never let pain turn him cruel. Gentleness in a sad smile, a smile America will remember forever. When we look at Fred Couples' life, from misty Jefferson Park to legendary Augusta, from panic-filled nights in Houston to lonely hotel nights on tour, from a broken marriage to Deborah's heart-wrenching death, from a body that betrayed him to age 66, filled with the sound of creaking bones, America doesn't just see an athlete's journey. America sees a mirror reflecting a truth about being human. Some pain never shows under the lights, yet carves itself into every breath of a lifetime. Fred Couples did not live an extraordinary life because he was always strong. He lived an extraordinary life because he endured pain yet stayed gentle, was wounded by life, yet remained kind, fell many times yet stood up again in silence. And in that silence is a lesson louder than any victory he ever won. A lesson America needs to hear, needs to repeat, needs to cherish. Not all pain is visible to the eye. We see Fred swing, effortless, fluid, perfect, But we don't see the nights he curled up in the shower, because his back hurt so badly he thought he would pass out. We see him smile for the cameras. But we don't see the nights he paced in darkness because his spine wouldn't let him sleep. We see him celebrate victories, but we don't see the night of the 1992 Masters, when he sat alone in a dark room, clutching his back, breathing heavily through constant pain. And when Deborah died, the world thought Fred was the strong, calm man, but no one saw him collapse to the floor, hands shaking, heart crushed by guilt. I should have been the one to keep her alive. Not all pain is loud. Some pain, especially the kind rooted in childhood memories, follows you to the end without anyone ever knowing. Fred's life reminds us, never judge a person by their silence alone, because sometimes behind the lightest smile is the heaviest heart. An angel on the golf course, who simply loved silence too much. Fred Couples fans still call him that with unchanged affection. Always made golf look effortless. His shots were so beautiful, even the best players sighed in wonder. But that ease didn't come from luck or pure talent. It came from a childhood filled with shouting, from a little boy who ran to the public course to escape a home that never knew peace. His swing, so seemingly weightless, was forged in thousands of freezing mornings, thousands of panic attacks, thousands of balls hit to keep his mind off the yelling inside that small Seattle house. Golf was the only place he could breathe, and what the world saw as the pure beauty of the game was on the inside the old wound of a child who never fully healed. Sometimes angels are born from wounds. Sometimes the people who make our lives more beautiful are the ones whose own lives were very sad. Gentleness comes from souls that have endured too much loss. Many people ask why Fred is always kind, why he never speaks ill of anyone, why he always smiles even when his heart is carrying so much sorrow. The answer lies in his own life. The people who suffer the most are often the kindest. Fred did not grow up with encouragement. He did not grow up with hugs. He did not grow up hearing "you did great, son." He grew up in silence. He grew up in fear. He grew up in loneliness. And when he became an adult, he chose the exact opposite of what he had received. He chose to love in the lightest way, to treat others with the greatest kindness, to never hurt anyone, even though he himself hurt more than everyone combined. America loves Fred not because he was the strongest. America loves him because he never let pain turn him into a bad person. Not everyone has a cookie like Magic. Some people have to keep themselves alive alone. Magic Johnson had Cookie, who pulled him from the abyss. Tiger Woods had an entire team behind him to help him stand again. Jack Nicklaus had a big family always by his side. And Fred had silence. He walked through everything: childhood trauma, divorce, the loss of his ex-wife, a body that betrayed him, completely alone. No one pulled him up. No one shielded him from the storm. No one held him when he collapsed. He had to stand up by himself, untie every knot in his heart by himself, walk onto the course by himself, when his back hurt so badly he couldn't even bend to pick up a ball. Some journeys have no cookie, only quiet resilience. And Fred Couples is the most beautiful proof of that. Fred taught America that strength is not the absence of pain, it is continuing to live when the pain has not lessened at all. At 66, his back still cracks every time he stands. He still loses sleep many nights. His friends are still slowly leaving this life. He is still afraid of loneliness replaying in his final days. Yet every morning he gets up, still hits a few soft chips, still walks slowly along the beach, still smiles at fans asking for autographs. That is strength, not the Hollywood kind, but the kind ordinary people who have hurt too much possess when they still choose to look at life with gentle-eyed. Fred's greatest legacy is not the green jacket, it is the lesson in human kindness. His titles will one day be just numbers. His victories will live in record books. His picture-perfect swings will be analyzed in slow-motion videos. But what makes him immortal in America's heart is his soul, the humility, the kindness, the gentleness, the silence that was never bitter, the endurance that never complained, the pain that never turned into hatred. That is the true legacy of Fred Couples, a man who was not perfect but beautiful in the way the most wounded souls often are. And now, when he looks out at Newport Beach every evening, perhaps sometimes Fred still thinks of Deborah, still remembers the years he suffered in silence, still remembers the young days he was lonely amid glory, still remembers mornings he couldn't sit up, still remembers nights he had to pace in the dark to ease the pain. But now he is no longer alone. Suzanne is there, placing a hand on his shoulder whenever his back stabs. The fans are there, loving him with the gentlest respect. America is there, calling him by the name they reserve for those they truly cherish, Gentle Fred. A quiet message to anyone hearing this story. If life is hurting you right now, remember Fred Couples. If you feel you're fighting alone, remember Fred Couples. If you feel lonely in a crowd, remember Fred Couples. If you think you're no longer strong enough to go on, remember Fred Couples. Because he taught us that you don't have to be perfect to deserve love. You don't have to be strong all the time to be brave. You don't have to be free of pain to live a beautiful life. You only have to, like Fred, try to stand up one more time each morning. And finally, as a wish for you, for everyone who has ever hurt the way Fred hurt, may you have a peaceful life, a soft heart, and the strength to stand up one more time, no matter how dark the night before was. If this story touched you, please leave a like, as a quiet thank you to the man who lived a very painful life, yet remained gentle with the world. When we close the journey of Fred Couples, it's hard not to choke up before a life that was so beautiful, yet so full of cracks. It is not just the legend with the breezy swing at Augusta 1992, where all America saw the green Masters jacket, but no one saw him curled up in the hotel bathtub, back burning like it was breaking, celebrating alone in a dark room. It is the little boy in Seattle escaping a house full of shouting, quietly walking to foggy Jefferson Park, hitting ball after ball, so he wouldn't have to hear his mother cry, or his father yell. It is the man who collapsed to the floor when he heard Deborah had taken her own life, carrying for the rest of his days the question, "I should have been the one to keep her alive," then sleepless, depressed, disappearing from the world. It is the body betrayed by a spine like torn paper, every morning taking minutes just to roll out of bed, every night pacing in darkness, listening to bones creak instead of applause, that has gone silent. Yet through all those tragedies, Fred still lived gently, never aggressive, never bitter, returning to the Champions Tour at 52, 53, 55, winning like a miracle, making fans weep because he embodied the man who doesn't know how to quit. And at the end of the road, with Suzanne beside him, he finally learned to speak his pain instead of staying silent. That story sends America a very American yet very human reminder: don't judge anyone by their smile alone, respect mental health, the same way we respect success, be gentler with one another, because sometimes the people who make our lives more beautiful are the ones who have suffered the most. If the story of a man who endured so much pain, yet lived with gentleness like Fred Couples touched you, please subscribe so we can walk together through more emotional journeys ahead. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we continue to honor the human beings who rose from darkness with whatever strength was left in their hearts.